This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Pan Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and before we start, I'd like to make a special appeal. If you like what we do here, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going on to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. In return, every week, my co-host Dalia and I will bring you episodes talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. My guest today is a professor of humanities at Columbia University in New York. He's currently visiting Israel as a speaker at Global Forum of the National Library of Israel. He is the author of several books, most recently The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics, that was published in 2017 by HarperCollins. Professor Mark Lilla, hello and welcome.
Good to be here.
So how would you characterize the current crisis of liberalism?
I would say that the current crisis of liberalism is tied to very basic facts. And one of them is, and I won't be saying anything terribly original here, one of them is increasingly liquid nature of our world, that our economies are open, our cultures are open, our borders in many places are open even if we don't want them to be open. So liberalism is having to face a situation. You can use different terms to talk about that. Tom Friedman says the earth is flat. People talk about globalization and so on. But the liberal tradition that I'm attached to is a liberal national tradition. It's a kind of civic tradition of the sort represented here in Israel by Yael Tamir. And so there's one challenge on that side. And the other challenge is the kind of nativist challenge that has arisen in reaction to these forces. And because of that, this liberal democratic tradition is being questioned. The legitimacy of liberal democracy itself is coming into question. And so it's almost like a pincer movement from two sides. One are these global forces and the other are these native ones. And so I guess the third factor would be the inability of liberal democracies and people who live in them to articulate what they're about and to defend them. And that has to do with all sorts of intellectual developments, one of them being, but only one of them being identity politics, which is the focus of the last book.
So basically you're saying that liberal circles have reacted to these challenges in the wrong way. They shouldn't have done what they should have done.
Well, liberal circles, I'm not sure. We have to be precise what we're talking about. So are we talking about liberal political regimes, or are we talking about liberal people? And by liberal, do we mean left-wing people, or do we mean something else? So tell me how you mean it.
So isn't that really the core of the problem, that liberalism is a mixed bag of too many different ideologies, orientations that, just maybe survived under the same umbrella for an X amount of years, but I mean the political circumstances that allowed that are simply gone.
Yeah, and I think we put a lot of weight on the word more than it can bear, and now it's revealing that we have to do some thinking about these separate things. What is the nation state in terms of liberalism? What is social protection in liberalism? What is relation a liberal society towards a capitalism that is no longer national or manageable? And so we've got to disaggregate the bits that have been part of the liberal tradition and then think about them separately.
You claim in the book that identity politics basically disintegrates the larger groupings of society that have allowed for that liberal tradition to exist. The nation state is one of several. But, the nation state was also the point of reference of the right, of the nationalist right, of the national right, not even, radical and moderate. How did they survive the crisis of the nation state? I mean, what did they do right that the liberals didn't?
Well, I mean, the history of nationalism, begins, there's a right wing and a left wing, or more classic liberal tradition of the nation state running back, since the French Revolution, and it's operated on both sides. No, I mean, what's striking about the right-wing regimes today, the so-called populist regimes, it's a term I'm comfortable with, but, a lot more is involved with it, is that they survive on the basis of a specter, that there is some kind of enemy, internal enemy or external enemy. There's some story being told about how the sovereignty of the people has been stolen or betrayed. And eventually those governments are going to have to deliver, because you can't run on that for very long. So when you say, how do you explain the success of some of these, I think it's too soon to tell, right? So the challenge is for those of us who are tied to a more civic and moderate Enlightenment tradition to learn again what it is that makes us able to survive when we do. And there's been a lot of forgetting. And part of the forgetting has come from a certain kind of left liberalism that on the one hand is very universalist, and on the other hand believes in the sanctity of individuals. And both of those forces, or both of those notions, can be hostile to the idea of a nation. But the only way you have welfare services, the only way you protect individuals, the only way you are able to promote human rights is by having a state and having a legitimate state, right? And so we developed kinds of liberalism that were not thinking the state, and especially the connection between having such a state and having it rooted not just in the minds of people but in their hearts, the kind of emotional attachment, a kind of disparagement of national attachment, suspicion that it's all racism, that it's exclusionary and all the rest. Well, that kind of universalist liberalism has succeeded beyond its wildest dreams, because it's helped to undo that kind of attachment to liberal Republican project. And so people withdraw and attach themselves to their identities on the right. And so you have a kind of identity individualism on the left, and then you have a kind of xenophobic identity politics on the right.
But the identity politics and the antagonism towards the state are not necessarily complementary. I mean, if you take a place like Germany, for example, that they have become pretty anti-nationalist because of their past. I mean, any attachment to the nation in more than a very minimal degree is frowned upon in many places in Germany. Yet, it is still a very statist kind of society that relies a lot on the welfare state and the nation state, federalism and all that, state services, etc. Why don't you see like a similar kind of problem there, that you have on the one hand, anti-nationalism, and on the other hand, a great belief in the state? Do you see what I mean?
Oh, yeah, but that the support of the state is a kind of reflexive, because people have grown up with it there. If they were to start all over again, would they have it? I don't know.
So my question is, why can't it be replicated elsewhere, predominantly in the United States?
Well, I would raise doubts about the German example, For quite some time, anti-nationalism has been part of the curriculum, so to speak, in not only in schools, but in politics, in the media, and in publishing. But it's a funny kind of anti-nationalism, because it says, do not think of yourself as German. Think of yourself as a citizen of the world, and so do not think of yourself as German, except in one respect, that you bear guilt. Now, that is an unhealthy relationship in two ways. One is that people can react to the guilt part of that. The other is that they can take seriously the idea that I'm not a German. I'm just a member of the global economy. I have no attachment. I have no responsibilities here. Yes, I want the state because it helps the economy to function. And of course, I want my pension, but it's not as if I have a sense of collective identity and responsibility. It's just I want services. it's interesting you use the word state instead of nation or republic, right? One thinks of an apparatus.
Exactly.
But, I'm attached to a tradition that sees the state as dependent, as a tool for the common and for the common good and for the collectivity.
So you're saying that the German model is just not sustainable, looking at the nation state as some sort of apparatus. It's got to be more than that.
Yeah, well, you can't tell people in the long term that they are and are not members of that state and that they are not members of a nation that not only may have things to be proud of, may have things to be embarrassed about, but that shares a historical destiny, and that you want to build a sense of collective identity and commitment that's not just based on guilt.
How does it manifest itself in the United States? You say in the book that the problem with identity politics is that it's politically disarming, that it's also almost anathema to politics as we perceive it. Where and when did it start? Can you put your finger on when did identity politics tip the balance, as it were, and became from this somewhat cultural phenomenon into something that is more politically debilitating?
Yeah. Well, you can use the term identity politics to talk about all sorts of things that go way back in American history. The relation to the Indians, slavery, racism. The Ku Klux Klan is probably the first identity group that was active in politics. But I'm talking about a bunch in the book anyway. I'm focusing on a shorter history. And the story I'm trying to understand is how you had a liberal left that was dominant in American politics from the 1930s until the 1970s and was able to articulate a sense of the nation, of duty, of patriotism that was also tied to progressive politics. Why was it that when that was challenged by a new vision, which was the Reagan vision, which sees the nation maybe mainly as an agglomeration of individuals. Yes, they're in their families. Yes, they're in the churches. But everyone's sort of responsible for themselves. If we get the state out of the way, everyone will do better. It was a different picture of the society. That my side, the Democratic, liberal left, rather than offering a new vision, a 2.0 version of a liberalism that defends the common good and that defends a certain kind of patriotism, instead indulged in identity politics, of which there were two kinds. One was a kind of group identity politics, which is consistent with the old model, and that is that as African Americans or gay people and so on, we are not being treated as equal citizens. We ought to be equal citizens, and therefore we militate through the political system in order to get our rights. And you become an interest group fighting for your rights. That's very normal. But another kind of identity politics grew up that was an sense of intimate identity, not belonging so much to a group as discovering who you are as in your secret self, that kind of inner identity homunculus that would be made up of the fact that, well, yes, I'm Jewish, but I'm also a lesbian, and I come from this part of the country, and these all make up part of my identity. And that self-consciousness became tied to movements that were not focused on achieving political power with other interest groups, but rather to changing the culture. And so you saw a shift to a kind of cultural politics that has been successful when it comes to the media and education, that, the country looks different, it talks differently about itself because there's been a kind of heightened awareness of these differences. But that kind of identity politics does not translate into political power. On the contrary, people are aware of the differences among themselves. They tend to feel that they're not being recognized. You can't understand me if I'm a black woman because you're a white man. That leads to a kind of divisiveness that purely in practical political terms is deadly, because you become more concerned with making a point than with making a change. And there's an unwillingness to lose yourself in the common struggle because you're always making special claims. And so the culmination of that was a campaign of Hillary Clinton. Now, this was not the only reason, not even the main reason why she lost, but she had a tick when she went out and spoke. She would begin by calling out to different groups. I'm glad to see that my LGBT supporters are here, Latino supporters are here, and black supporters are here. One, if you're going to mention some people, you better mention everyone. She would not mention white ethnics. But the other is that she was not able to mobilize a kind of rhetorical language rich in symbols of what we share in the common good and the common struggle. And so among the other reasons why she was unliked and so on is that she offended a lot of white voters who felt they weren't being addressed, but also failed to inspire them with the sense that we have a common project here. And it's not just a question of each individual getting along by themselves, that a republic is not a campsite. It's not a place where you pull in your vehicle and plug in for the electricity and the water and the Wi-Fi and pull out when you want to. We have commitments. We have commitments in time. And that is absent from Republican rhetoric, but it's also absent from Democratic rhetoric. And so we've disarmed ourselves through this kind of identity politics.
But isn't it just down to her, or perhaps her circle? I mean, to her as an individual unsuccessful politician? Because if you look a bit further back, I mean, you say that classic American liberalism declined in the 1970s, but since then there have been two very successful Democratic presidencies that have gained a lot of political power and also made a long-lasting difference on the history of the country. I mean, compared to Israel, where a liberal government is really a distant memory.
Yeah.
So is it really a crisis of a movement per se, or is it just, a conjunction of several rather unlucky circumstances that led us to where we are today?
Yeah, I think it's very important for non-Americans if they want to understand America, stop focusing on the presidency. Americans, too, have a daddy complex about a president, and the rest of the world does, too. It wants a big daddy in America. But presidents have very limited power if they do not have congressional majorities, right? And you had two presidents you're referring to, Clinton and Obama, who in half or more than half of their time in office faced Republican Congress and resistance, were not able to do a lot of the things that they thought they were voted in to do. But the real power, even more power, on the issues, certain issues that matter to us, are held at the state level. And prior to the last election, which was a big election that was good for the Democrats and was a reaction to Trump.
You're talking about the midterms.
The midterm elections. Before that, when I wrote the book, Republicans controlled 2/3 of the state legislatures, 2/3 of the governorships. They controlled more than just under half of the states outright, which meant if they won a few more states, they could conceivably, it's hard to imagine this happening, they could conceivably call a constitutional convention and rewrite the Constitution. That's how it happens at the state level. But to get in, and what's happening at the state level? The Supreme Court has given us abortion rights, but in states all across the country, those rights are de facto are being denied by placing barriers in the way of women who want an abortion. Gerrymandering has diminished the power of the African American vote and some other minorities. Labor legislation has busted unions. So if you really care about these issues, it's not just you have to elect a president. If you care about abortion in Iowa, you got to go to Iowa. And you got to convince Iowans that they ought to vote Democratic. And Iowa is an overwhelmingly white state and very religious. And that means you have to get over yourself and your own issues out of your own interests. You need to speak a language that goes beyond your group in order to inspire people to join in a common cause to defend a whole range of issues.
And that's something that Republicans do better because they speak a language of religion that's really universal and, family values and all sorts of conservative values that are basically a lot more popular than, identity politics, whether it's, minority rights, etc.
Well, also they aren't cultural snobs. And the Democratic Party is a kind of split party between cultural elites and minorities. And Republicans are very good at going out and winning state election, winning local election. They spend a lot of time going to community, parades and things that Americans do. And they show themselves as present. They aren't just on the two coasts or floating above in the media. So they actually were willing to engage in that kind of gritty politics that American democratic elites have not been willing to do. And now, what I call in the book the Reagan dispensation, that promoted all the values you just articulated, has been followed by we still don't know what, but it's not that. Donald Trump brought to an end the Reagan era. And it happened at a very interesting moment in the campaign when all the candidates for presidency were at a debate, and there were a whole bunch of them, the first few, right? And a question came up about protecting American workers. And one after another, they were all saying that, we need to grow the economy and eventually that will raise jobs. And Trump said, that's not going to work. We have to protect our workers. Now, that was apostasy. And all the other candidates looked at their shoes uncomfortably, like someone had just said something uncouth. And that electrified the public, you see? And so what Trumpism represents, what the power out there can become, is still up for grabs. So right now, I'm living in a vision-free country. The Republicans do not offer a coherent vision of what we are as a country. Democrats are not able to do that. And the first one to do that is going to win.
That's actually what was going to be my next question, because there's really, in the book, there's a lot of criticism, but I don't feel there's a lot of despair, unlike so many others who've written about the decline of politics as we know it. As you said earlier in this conversation, the Trump instinct will exhaust itself at some point. That it's really not sustainable over time. And as you said, now again, it really is devoid of any vision. So there's really nothing to work on there. Do you see anyone in any corner of the American public debate, political debate, cultural debate, anyone articulating it? Obama is one who did it well, and he stood down very recently. I mean, so it's not a lost cause yet, is it?
Well, again, you're focusing on individuals and presidents. That is part...
No, but Obama, as a cultural icon, is someone who's also African-American, who's also liberal, who also has a part, who could harness his own sort of identity politics into something larger than, the very fragmented and compartmentalized identity politics.
Well, he passed the identity test for Democratic elites, but he didn't talk about it much. And there's a lot of resentment in the black community that he didn't talk more about the state of black America. But, he was a noble outlier. There's a culture of liberals in the States that I'm talking about. And, it's not like in other countries where you can point to a party apparatus and talk about the elites there who are in the party, are paid by the party, or are elected officials that kind of govern things, Our parties broke down starting in the 1970s, and essentially they're vehicles for presidential campaigns now. So to understand what liberal opinion is, you got to look a little bit everywhere. You have to see what intellectual opinion is. You have to see what's being taught in the schools. You really have to see what's being shown on television and in movies. Hollywood has transformed America's understanding of itself, also in distorted ways. I tell my students this sometimes, and they're surprised. Well, I ask them, I say, what percentage of the U.S. population would you imagine self-identifies as transgender? And they say, 5%, 6%. And I say, okay, it's 1/2 of 1%, or a little less.
That's more than I thought, actually.
What percentage of the country is evangelical? 10%, 5%. 25%, 1 out of every 5. Which group have you learned more about in college? Transgender people or evangelicals? And the answer is transgender people. If you look on television, there are transgender characters, there are gay characters, there are ambiguous, now there's a whole long list of letters we're supposed to use for people. You never see a family bowing its head in prayer in a movie or a television series, just as a matter of course, not that that's the subject of the movie. You don't see religious people. And they're out there. They're determining the country. That's how blind the elite is.
But isn't that, conversely, you can say it's just that we are right now in a period of transition, that the evangelical families that currently determining politics are an elite in decline or majority in decline, whether numerical or cultural, and the more diverse multicultural American society is the American society of the future.
Well, look, we're much less multicultural than you might think, and I'll explain what I mean there. These figures about the waning of white America are complicated. But the idea that we're becoming a multicultural society, in a sense, it's because it's been willed by cultural elites.
Interesting. The book is very, I'd say, American in its scope. Yet it has already been translated into 11 languages, not Hebrew yet.
Not Hebrew yet.
But it has had quite a significant international success. How do you see, what's really the international appeal of the story that you tell in the book? What is it?
I mean, my expectation was pretty much, I suppose, what yours was when we met here, and that is this is a very American book. I didn't expect it to be translated anywhere, frankly. 11 languages, all over Asia. I've been traveling all over the world to places where this is an issue. I'm here in Israel. I was in Brazil. I was in Dubai. I was in Spain. I was in Italy. I've been in France. I haven't been to Asia yet for this, though the book's coming out in Chinese and in Japanese and in Korean. What's that about? Well, it turns out that every country is having identity anxieties now. But what I'm learning as I travel is that there are anxieties about different things in different places. That's what, and the book struck a chord. So in two senses. One, there are identity problems in different places, often surprising ones. For example, in Spain, there's not all that much concern about immigration. The real concern is Catalonia. What happens there? Are the Catalonians a separate identity? Should they have a separate state? So it's a lot of rhetoric about identity, pro and against, that's focused on that. Right? Bolsonaro being elected in Brazil has raised questions of what kind of multiracial society we are in Brazil. That doesn't have to do with immigration at all. It has to do with the kind of state it's been for a very long time, and so on and so on. The one common thread is this, and that has been the difficulty that liberal to left parties and intellectuals have had in coping with what we'll call populism that has all sorts of other elements, right? And so a lot of the conversation has been about the decline of the left in all these places and the rise of a kind of political reaction. I have wonderful conversations about all of that abroad. In the States, I'm a bit of a pariah. The only people who invite me now to talk are conservatives with whom I don't share everything by any means, and so I end up being the liberal they invite. Yeah. On the left, I've been treated as a racist. One of my colleagues, I've never met her, at Columbia a week after the book was published. After the book came out of an article in the New York Times, which was the most read political article in the New York Times of that year. And a week after that article came out, this colleague wrote a long piece in the Los Angeles Review of Books comparing me to David Duke, who is the president of the Ku Klux Klan, saying, this is nearly a quote, One wears white robes, one wears academic robes, but they're speaking the same language. And so the moralism, the hysteria around identity, I felt the full brunt of. And what leads me, where I do despair, is that it's been hard. I'm not very hopeful right now of my side waking up and understanding the situation they've been in, because there's a strong urge, certainly by the Twitterati, right, who, people with 2 followers, but they show up on Twitter feeds and seem to have an effect, is that there's a kind of shaming that goes on. And, I've talked to senators, I've talked to people in the labor movement and so on. A lot of people tell me, well, I really liked your book, but they won't come out and say anything about it for fear of being branded. So it's going to take a while.
Yeah. And it seems to me that you're not necessarily against, identity politics per se, but against what it doesn't have, which is perhaps a more like another layer that is common or unifying that could potentially reside in harmony with these different identities. It's not one or the other.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's totally the point. But
what is that unifying message? What do you think it will be?
Well, first let me say that I actually care about all these groups. And the message I can't seem to get through is that if you don't get political power and govern, you cannot protect yourselves. You're in love with noble defeats. That is why we're losing abortion rights. That is why African American voting rights are under threat now, because of the way you've gone about this. And so
what's your political advice to them?
Well, it is to rehabilitate and think through what we share as citizens, that we share an identity as citizens, that we know. And, it's a significant identity because we're able to exercise power through it. But being all citizens not only is not in conflict with our other attachments and identities, but our common citizenship provides a vocabulary for defending our rights in each of those groups. Because those groups are able to claim that we're being treated different when we are not different in terms of our citizenship.
So do you think there's really a deficient concept of citizenship in America, specifically in the American left?
Oh, very much so. The word, you can't use the word because it's thought to be anti-immigrant. And so you've got to recover the word there. It seems to be already exclusionary. But also,
I'm not talking about citizenship having a passport or belonging, being a citizen. I'm talking about citizenship as a concept.
I'm too. But the moment you use the word, you're told you're not supposed to use the word because it's charged. And so there's a yearning for, community. There's a yearning on the left for welfare programs and so on. But what we lack is a vocabulary for solidarity. Why do we owe anything to anybody else? On what basis? Well, the Bible used to teach us that. People don't read the Bible so much anymore. And the people who do read it have taken out the Sermon on the Mount that says we have to take care of the poor.
What about the resurgence, again, limited, of American socialism?
Oh, it's an internet phenomenon. It has no legs whatsoever. Even if you look at the people like Ocasio-Cortez, who's a woman who is now a congresswoman in the recent election, she's gotten a lot of press. She's very photogenic, very articulate, a real fighter. I admire all of that in her. But she essentially was voted in by yuppies in her district.
Well, that sounds like a unifying message, isn't it? Solidarity of, accounting for the other, unionizing, all sorts of economic rights.
Yeah, but the problem of socialism, if you use the word, already has all sorts of connotations, so it's suicide. But socialism was international. It was not national, except for national socialism, right? And you've got to talk about particular communities and develop a sense of attachment there and understand and be attached to the institution. So what I was going to say when I lost my train of thought was that civic education, to the extent that it exists in our schools in the United States today, is basically about becoming an activist. You care about an issue, you join a social movement, and you get a piece of legislation passed, high five. But that's not the same thing as having a living, breathing party that is interested in governing, taking over the Senate, taking over state legislatures so that we can enact all kinds of legislation that affects either everybody or every group gets legislation that helps them. That mentality is gone.
All right. Professor Mark Lilla, I'm afraid we've run out of time, even though I would have continued this conversation for a very long time. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks.